There's nothing between us and dinner, so we're good. Or this is all there is. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, my friend, for this is a really pleasant surprise. The book came out a couple of weeks ago, and I've been all over the place talking about it. And there have been different people who've been discussing it with me. But the fact that you're here, not everybody knows, and I've been instructed not to say how long it's been, but we've been friends for many years. We went to college together and grew up together, and strangely our lives have intersected in the last few years in a way that maybe we should have known, but we didn't know at the time. So it's such an important thing for me to be talking to you about this book, which is a bit of a story of how I've become influenced into being a bit more of an activist about the things that I do, given that that's been your life.
Yes. Well, thank you very much. Thank you all for being here, and thanks to the Global Security Forum. And thank you, Ali, for writing this book and for asking me to be in conversation with you.
My pleasure.
It's a little bit odd for me to be on this side of the microphone because you're usually the one who's grilling me.
That's right.
So it's kind of a pleasure to be on the other side now, and I can see how difficult.
Feel free to ask me all those uncomfortable positions when I put you on the spot on live TV.
Yes. So, you know, as you already mentioned, we first met many moons ago. I don't remember what you were doing your master's. I was in law school, so this was quite some time. And then immediately thereafter, I remember seeing you on CTV.
Right.
And then from CTV so CTV, Canadian television, and then from Canadian television onto CNN, and then later Al Jazeera, and then MSNBC. And so it's been a delight to remain in touch all of these years. I've read your book and was really struck by I was left with a question of why write the book. And you answer the book in the prologue. So I would love for people to hear just a little bit about why you decided to write this book, given the history, your past, and so on, and where we are at.
Well, I had zero interest in writing anything that feels like a memoir, because I feel like you have to be substantially older than I am to write a memoir. So it's really it's a book about a bunch of other things that's loosely disguised as a memoir that traces moments in history over the last 125 years and gives the impression that my family is like Forrest Gump, that they keep showing up at these important moments in history. But in fact, everybody's family shows up at important moments in history. I just use those elements of time to give the reader a sense of where we are while I'm talking about my particular family and the particular struggles they're having, where it places in history. And there are two key points here. One is that there is one major intersection between my family and the history that would unfold that would result in their migration from essentially what started in India and then to South Africa and then to Kenya and then to Canada and for myself to the United States. And it started because my great-grandfather was friends with Gandhi in South Africa. And Gandhi lived in Johannesburg. My great-grandfather lived in Pretoria. And, you know, today that's about a 45-minute drive, but back then it was a 2-day journey. And Gandhi was constantly agitating to get small matters of injustice fixed in South Africa. This was in the early 1900s. And he would then have to come and negotiate with the government because they'd launch a strike or something of that nature. They'd have some kind of a protest and a bunch of Indians and other non-whites would be jailed. And he would stay at my grandfather's house, my great-grandfather's house in Pretoria. And one night they're sitting and talking, and Gandhi expresses disdain for the fact that the Indian community in South Africa does not have what it takes to fight the injustice. At the time, it was colonial injustice that was underway. Small matters, you know, little petty things that they would do that would become apartheid, which was really just a series of petty laws, but there were so many of them that they became Byzantine. But Gandhi felt that the Indians were weak. So he said, I want to build an ashram, a community, a commune, if you will. in which everybody will grow their own food and they will mend their own clothes, and there's no hot water and there's no meat and there's no beds to sleep on. You will sleep on the floor. You get one blanket to lay under you and one blanket to lay on top of you. My grandfather, sitting where you were, thinks that's a stupid idea. He's a businessman who has finally achieved some degree, like many Indians. They had gone from having push carts and wagons, that they'd sell goods out of, into actually having storefronts, and thought, we're prospering. We were able to send some money home to India and pay off our debts. I don't want to get involved with this rabble-rouser. So he says to Gandhi, here's the problem. We are Muslims.
Yes.
You are Hindu. I can't send my 7-year-old son to your crazy ashram school. He has to stay here, learn his schooling, and learn his religion. To which Gandhi says, I will learn your religion and teach it to him, which he does. And Gandhi not only learns about Islam, he learns about Judaism, he learns about Christianity, and of course he already knows about Hinduism. And it sort of develops him into the pluralist that he became, because back in 1910, when this happened, my grandfather was 7 years old and did become his youngest student. Back then, in those early days, maybe a little before that, a bit of a racist. He was not a guy who thought the colonial experiment should end. He just wanted it to be a bit better for the Indians. And he wanted the Indians a little closer up to the whites than they actually were. Only later did he come to the idea that if one of us are in chains, all of us are in chains. That equality is equality for everyone, liberty is liberty for everyone, justice is justice for everyone. And long answer to your question, we are in a world in which that's not true. Justice is not justice for everyone. We can talk about the world or we can talk about America right now. Either way, it still applies. Everybody doesn't enjoy justice the same way. Everybody does not enjoy liberty the same way. Everybody does not enjoy the same set of rights. But for those of us who do enjoy rights, i.e. if you're a man in America, you tend to think it's all pretty much okay and there's nothing to fight for. And what this reminds us all of is that there is always something to fight for. It doesn't actually mean society's broken. It just means it can do better. And the second point about the book is to show you how much actual failure there was in the last 125 years of my family. Some of the most poignant parts in the book are moments in which there has been massive and catastrophic failure. The failure of my grandparents and my parents' business in South Africa and the tearing of that down, the death of my grandfather in 1961, who was 58 years old, thinking that his entire life training, the training that he got under Gandhi to fight apartheid in South Africa, had all failed. He never learned that my father would run for office in Canada. And when my father ran for office in Canada, I thought he was going to win, but he lost.
I didn't even know that.
And so, the concept of doing what you must do to fix the things in front of you, whether or not success or failure are the fruits of those things, is, I thought, a message that is timely in the world right now, a world which feels overwhelming, a world which feels like so much is wrong that it's unfixable. And the message of the book is that everything in front of you is fixable. The whole thing is fixable when we work together and the intentions are right and the work is right. That's not where we are in the world right now. It's not where we are in Russia, Ukraine. It's not where we are in the part of the world in which you live, in Israel, Palestine. But it can get there. It can get there, and your efforts may look like they are failing or getting you nowhere, but that is actually of secondary importance to the actual effort.
Yes. And in the book, you describe, actually in the prologue, which I found very interesting, it was 4 years plus a day.
4 years plus a day, yeah.
To an incident that happened with you that made you take your American citizenship very seriously. Can you tell us a little bit about what happened to you 4 years?
Yeah, I was wholly uninterested in becoming an American citizen. I'm a Canadian citizen, and I happen to hold a few other citizenships, but given how many national security people there are in the room, I'm not going to discuss that part, because it may or may not be legal. But as a Canadian citizen living on a green card in the United States, none of this was particularly important to me. And I had a conversation with a fellow journalist who was also a Canadian who had become an American. And she asked me, why haven't you taken your citizenship yet? And I said, because then I'll have to do jury duty. And she really lit into me. I just meant it as a joke. But she said, so you are prepared to be here, you are prepared to enjoy the fruits of living in America, you are prepared to enjoy the benefits of citizenship, or benefits of being here, but you do not wish to engage in any of the obligations of citizenship. And what I learned subsequently is that the jury duty was the unimportant part. One should do it. I still haven't done it. I'm a citizen and no one's called me for jury duty. And because of the story I'm about to tell you, I may never end up on a jury.
I don't think it's going to happen, yes.
But I was covering the protests after the killing of George Floyd, which were quite remarkable because they became in the early days quite violent. He was killed on a Monday. The officers were suspended a couple of days later, but no one was arrested, even though the entire thing was on video. And then they were finally arrested and charged with murder and, as you know, subsequently convicted, which is unheard of, to be convicted, police being convicted of killing a man. But I was covering those protests, and on the Saturday night after, which was 4 years ago and a day ago, I was covering the protests. They were very, very calm. The alert came out to say that Minneapolis is under curfew. If you remain outside, you are subject to arrest. And the entire group of people, thousands of people who were protesting in front of a police station, all sat down. Very Gandhian, felt very much like my my ancestors and what they would have done. And I'm thinking, where is this going to go? And they were sort of daring the police to say, if you're going to arrest us, you're going to have to pick us up and zip tie us and drag us out. Anyway, the police smartly didn't engage, so the group decided to walk. And it was a walk. It's not a march. It was nothing. It was a walk, and people were singing sort of protest songs. It was almost, and I don't mean to diminish it, but it was almost like little kids, going for a walk. There was nothing threatening or menacing about it. And all of a sudden, about half an hour, 45 minutes into this thing, police, National Guard, state police all move into the intersection in front of us, lights and sirens, and they get out and they start shooting tear gas canisters, flashbangs, and rubber bullets at us. And this is all live on TV. Now, most people can't withstand tear gas, so they had pulled back. So it was largely just my crew and a few stragglers. There are some people who can handle natural tear gas.
Palestinians.
And then, yeah, right. And then the police in front of us. And I was on TV and I was describing how they're shooting at us. Guy in front of me got hit. And then suddenly, while I'm on TV, I take a rubber bullet to my leg right here. Which is not a bad place to get hit by something, incidentally. Here, it would mess up your knee for the rest of your life, but here it's not bad. But that night, 300 journalists got attacked by the police. One got the rubber bullet here, took out her eye. She doesn't have an eye anymore. So, nobody has to explain this to you, but yeah. Rubber bullets and these less than lethal things are more lethal than you think, more dangerous than you think, and probably shouldn't be used unless in crowds like that. But it made me understand that I am no longer that guy who they say, what an exciting job you have. You have a front row seat to everything that's going on. Much like everybody in this room, and much like you, we are not observers to history. We are not people who have front row seats. We're actually in it. So I interview you routinely to provide analysis with what's going on in Israel and Palestine. But I often have to think of the fact that you're not an observer, you're in it. Yes. Like we are in it. And citizens of the 21st century in troubled places, and that includes America today, that includes many of our major democracies, are in it. We are foot soldiers for these societies, these governments, and if they are democracies, for the democracies in which we live. We cannot pretend not to be. I cannot pretend because I'm a journalist who has to bear witness to these things and then hold power to account that I am not somehow involved in it. So that separation in my mind between being an objective journalist who cannot become part of the story when in fact you are part of the story. Very deliberately, and for months subsequently I remained part of that story because despite the fact that I didn't want to continue the story, the President of the United States wanted to. And he kept telling that story at his rallies. Much better, very much like my friend John Miller here, who's in the front row, who tells stories that I've been involved in much better than I do, and they're just much better coming from him. That's what Donald Trump was like. He told the story of what happened to me in Minneapolis in a way that was much, much more interesting than the way I told it. But all of that is to say, we as journalists reporting on the front lines of these issues in America and around the world have become part of the story. We can, as many times as we'd like, say that that's not something that we're supposed to do, but we can't. And in my new reality, Deanna, I do wars, hurricanes, school shootings, civil unrest, all the bad things.
Correct.
And I'm allowed to say they're bad things. You know, they're all equally bad. Nobody criticizes me when I say a hurricane is really bad because it destroys your homes, or a school shooting is really bad because there are a lot of dead kids. I understood on that day that my obligation as a citizen is to fight those things in society that are bad in the society in which I live. That I am a journalist does not excuse me from doing that.
And what's interesting also about the book is something that is that there isn't an issue of identity that's brought up in the book. You mesh all of the different identities that you carry, that your ancestors have carried, and you bring it all together. So everything from India, South Africa, Kenya, Canada, and then the United States. How has that influenced your personal identity, all of these passports?
Well, it's fun now. It wasn't fun as a kid, because as a little kid growing up in very, very white Toronto, I didn't feel like I fit in completely. Things are very different now, right? Parents give their kids the really complicated ethnic names now with great pride, and the kids take great pride in having other people, learn to pronounce their names and spell them properly, and they take their cultural food to school. I hated that stuff, right? I grew up with a sari-wearing grandmother who spoke to me in Gujarati, whom I loved. I mean, I loved her and her cooking. Just didn't necessarily want to take that to lunch where everybody was having ham and cheese sandwiches at school. But, in our house, we were predominantly Indians. We were nominally Muslim, although overwhelmingly with Hindu overtures, in part because we were Indian Muslims, and my grandfather had grown up under Gandhi, so he didn't eat meat. My father was a vegetarian for many years. South Africa was the thing we discussed more than anything, because it was my parents' recent past, and it was so formative in their lives and the lives of my sister, who was 8 years older than I was. And yet the funny thing about being from South Africa and living in Canada is that South Africa was designed so that you couldn't take any of anybody else's culture.
Right.
Black people had their culture and their music. White people had their culture and their music. Indians had their culture and their music. So you couldn't decorate your house. You couldn't go to another country and be a connoisseur of all things South African. South Africans were whatever kind of South African they were in South Africa. Hence, we had moved to Kenya before we got to Canada, and the decorations in our house were Kenyan, because you were allowed to do that. Kenya allowed you to enjoy all those things. So Kenyan carvings and curios and woven baskets and things like that, that's what occupied my house. Now, for the average Canadian kid around me, they didn't know any of this stuff, right? They hardly knew any Indians. Canada back then is not Canada that it is today, this remarkably important multicultural cosmopolitan society. It was a really white provincial place at the time. So none of those identities mattered at all. The identities that were fraught and under battle in Canada at the time were the Catholics and the Protestants, the Catholic, and by the way, that was the French Catholics and the Irish Catholics and the Irish Protestants and the Scottish Presbyterians and the Anglicans. And there was people I couldn't tell the difference between had a lot of fights going on between themselves. They didn't have time for our fights. They didn't know who we were, or that there were a whole other bunch of people who were looking to enjoy rights in this society, because they were fighting a much older fight that was going on. So I didn't grow up understanding what identity I would identify with ultimately. I have since learned and grown into a place which allows me to appreciate all of my identities. Literally any room I go into, I will, if it's South Asians, I'll be an Indian in that room. And in the diaspora, we don't think as much about Indians versus Pakistanis. It's a big matter if you're India or you're Pakistan or you're from that place, but in the diaspora we think a little bit less of it. If I'm amongst Kenyans, if I'm amongst any Africans, I'm an African. If I'm amongst any Canadians, I'm absolutely a Canadian. It's all fungible now. Many Iranians meet me and think I'm Iranian, and I'm totally fine with that too. So it's one of those things that now I realize you can enjoy being who you are and being proud of who you are. But that was a struggle, because even in my work as a journalist, there weren't many of us.
No.
So you went out of your way to keep your head down, the hopes being nobody really catches on to the fact that you're different, and you work your way up into more and more important jobs, and at some point you'll have a say and you'll be able to direct the programming in a way that's meaningful for those like you. But we didn't talk about it at the time. Now you have journalists who are at the table talking about why their issues or the issues of their people are not being covered. And I think all of that is wonderful. I still meet journalists who play it the way I did. Just keep your head down and get it done, because that's culturally how I was raised to do it. But now everybody's got options. Now you can be your authentic self in many parts of the world, and that's, I enjoy that a lot. I'm very happy with that.
And it actually comes across in your journalism as well, because you now have these. You start off with your opinions and your ideas and your, I don't want to say monologues, but your thoughts.
But they're like that, yeah.
And so it's interesting for me to see how your career has progressed over the time, from CTV to CNN to Al Jazeera, and then later on to MSNBC.
Yeah.
So what's next?
Well, that's a good question. They all gave me really good stuff. Training in Canada is fantastic for a journalist, because you already started with fewer resources. So now we're in a world in media where there are fewer resources, and I started used to that. So I never got too familiar with the idea that working for U.S. networks is a fantastic thing with big teams that you get to enjoy. But CNN was a remarkable place to work. I know my friend Brianna Keeler's in here, and I know John works for CNN. There are few CNN people in here. That CNN red runs through my veins. I was there for many years, and I so deeply appreciate it. And I worry a little bit for CNN right now, because all of us are going through tough times, and it's not good for us when media that's trying to do well fails. We're all going through throes, and I suspect it'll all work out on the other end. But CNN showed me the world, and I got to see and tell stories that I wouldn't have otherwise told. Al Jazeera gave us a quality of journalism that I had never experienced at CNN. In fact, it was while I was working for CNN International, I would travel the world, and people all over the world would say, "Why can't you be more like Al Jazeera?" And I didn't really know what they were talking about. So I investigated it, and the depth with which we were able to cover stories at Al Jazeera, the idea that you would embed, you would stay somewhere for a long time until you had the fullness of the story, was really meaningful to me. And I was sad when the experiment with Al Jazeera in America shut down. And I wasn't looking to do more of it. I was really looking to write books, and I started lecturing a little bit, and I thought, that'll be my life. But an old friend of mine from CNN, who I write about in the book, had called me and said, "Can you help us out?" It was right before the election of 2016. And the general thinking was that Hillary Clinton was going to be the president of the United States, and that would be a fairly policy-oriented administration, because she's a policy-oriented kind of person. And because of my economics background, I would be well suited to, I'm that kind of guy who I'll read the bill, and I'll read all the details about it and discuss it with people. So I got hired October 25th, 2016, a couple of weeks before the election, on that expectation. Clearly, many of us were surprised or caught off guard, including myself, when Donald Trump got elected, and the whole thing changed. The whole reason I got hired was now gone, because no one thought Donald Trump was going to be a uniquely policy-oriented President of the United States. That's no disrespect to Donald Trump, just that was not the thinking, and it's still not the thinking. So now we had to do something else, because now we had the surprise President of the United States who was untested, whose policies we didn't know. We'd heard, he talks about them a lot, but we didn't know how they were going to be implemented. And for the 4 years of his presidency, we were in a different mode. We were chasing the things he was doing. And suddenly you'd be chasing it like that week, right? He would declare that would be infrastructure week one week, and by noon that day, he will have somehow changed off of that because he'd have fired somebody on Twitter or declared some other policy on Twitter, and then you're chasing that. So I wasn't doing the robust getting involved in policy that I was hoping to have done. It ended up being substantially more political and substantially more in tune with some of these commentaries and monologues that were necessary to help people understand where we were going as a country, because it had major implications for the rest of the world, as we initially saw with Ukraine, but we started to see with trade relations with China and many other things that have unfolded since then. What happens in America is very important to the rest of the world, whether they like it or not, whether they like America themselves or not. What we realize is that when America hasn't got its stuff together, it becomes hard for the rest of the world to get its stuff together, and we're literally watching that in real time right now.
Well, and it does feel really difficult, terrible at this point. And so to bring it back to the book, we're in a place, at least I am in a place now, as a Palestinian watching what's unfolding, and it feels very overwhelming.
Yes, I can imagine.
And helpless.
Yeah.
And so what are the small acts of courage?
Well, I think you live them. The fact is, every time I talk to you on TV, what we're not having every time is a 0 to 60 conversation about what has to be fixed, right? Because that's too big it's too big for a small television conversation. It's too big for people who don't have their heads around it to get their heads around it. It's too big to even think about all the consequences and ways in which we get there. So on one hand, when we have our conversations on TV, we thin slice them into what's the next thing that needs to happen? What's the thing that has to happen here? How should we be thinking about the next step in making this into a more finding a just peace in the Middle East, in which everybody can live in a peace that they have deserved for a long time and has not been given to them. On the other hand, you also have to be a complete person who can manage your family and your life so that you are not destroyed in the course of trying to make society a better place. And that means some of these small acts of courage I talk about, some of them are protesting. Some of them are taking tough decisions with your coworkers or your colleagues. Some of them are standing on a stage like this at an important gathering with people whose views you may not share and speaking hard truths. And perhaps not getting the round of applause that you would have liked if you had said something different. Some of it's just taking care of your family. Some of it's going back to school to get that degree that you didn't finish, or the further education, so that you're in a better position to keep those battles going. Some of it's doing what my grandparents did, where they planted the seeds of a tree whose fruit they never partook of, or whose shade they never sat in. I interviewed a woman from Philadelphia about a month ago. Her only job, she is the block captain of the block she lives on. Her job is to register everybody to vote and to get them to turn out to vote on election day, and she has 100% success. Now, can you imagine if everybody just did something as small as that? We'd fix the damn place. And that's my point, that you can look at climate change, you can look at Russia, Ukraine, you can look at all the hostages and the wrongfully detained around the world, you can look at Israel, Palestine, and by the way, there are people in this room who absolutely do all those things, and the solutions to these things may come from some of you in this room. But if you don't feel that you have the capacity to handle all of that all the time, just find the things that you do have the capacity to do, because by doing them, you will succeed. And in succeeding, you will feel more empowered to take on the next battle. When you meet some of the small heroes who we see in the United States, sometimes they're state legislators, sometimes they're people who have voted for a new school board so that books don't get banned. Small victories, may not even make it into the newspaper, but they're setting the stage for more important things to come. They're setting the stage for people to follow their acts. They're setting the stage for people to run after them. They're setting the stage for children to be able to read books that some would not have them read. So my whole point here is that small acts change the world, but they do it in two ways. One is your personal collection of small acts, the things that you do that don't amount to anything newsworthy, but you are consistently raising your children or educating someone or supporting a cause or partaking in civil society. And then there's the collective, the small acts that we all undertake jointly, which make a better society. Remember, in all of the societies that we talk about at this conference, some of which are troubled, some of which are moving very successfully, the ones that are troubled often have something in common, and that is a weakness in the establishment of civil society, largely because they have been dominated either by some form of corruption or some form of partisan politics, which has meant that the people who ascend to greater heights are people who have given fealty to the party as opposed to who are good at what they do. Being good at what you do in a society means that you are available to that society to hold an important position and to increasingly have that society move forward. So the book is what anybody wants it to be. In other words, those small acts of courage can be just the story of my family, or they can be inspiration to say, hey, I can do something that's going to feel kind of small, but I can get it done, and I can feel like I've done something, so that in 25 years, when our children and our grandchildren say, 2024 was a rough year, what were you doing? The answer cannot be nothing.
Yeah. Ali, also one of the messages that I took away from the book, and I don't know if you intended it to be this, is it feels very much like a love letter to your family and a deep appreciation. I think you started out in one way, and then along the way, developed a very strong, you could see where these small things that they did amounted to a lot. And so I appreciate that. I thought that was really lovely.
Yeah, it did become that, and because it was linkages, right? It became the idea that I thought my parents' history and their fight for the search for freedom and justice ended when they arrived in Canada.
Yes.
And it didn't occur to me that in 2020, 4 years ago, we'd all still be in this struggle. And what it pointed out to me is that societies do not arrive at perfection and then stay there. You have to work all the time. So while my great-grandfather was doing what he was doing, and Gandhi was doing what he was doing, and my grandfather was doing what he was doing to fight injustice, so was my father, so was my mother, also who was a political candidate. So was my sister, who was also a political candidate, and is the kind of person who gets things done for people. It doesn't stop because someone arrived at a place. And that is the beauty that we struggle with in America. Look, those of us who are Americans understand that there is remarkable danger in what our society may become. I had a remarkable conversation with the minister from Singapore, who was very optimistic and said he didn't think that America was facing an existential crisis, and I'm grateful that he thinks so, which is terrific. Maybe I'm too close to it. I'm a little more worried about it, but I'm also very clear on the fact that 100 million Americans didn't vote in the last election, which means there are solutions to these problems. I was in Philadelphia recently. They had a local election. 19% of the population voted, which means there's room to improve. There is much room to improve, and it's on us to improve it. And so I then leaned into my family's history as being people who took the small steps to improve literally the situation around them, their small committee, their small neighborhood organization, and that became bigger and bigger. And I speak to the expert Timothy Snyder from Yale University, who speaks a lot about tyranny. And when I say to Tim, I say, Tim, you're a Yale professor, I'm a TV host. We know the ways in which we are going to fight anti-democratic forces. We know the ways in which we are going to fight evil. We have platforms for it. What do regular people do? And he said things like, join the library, because the library knows, they have to keep track of how many people actually come and do that stuff. Tell your librarian you support them. Tell your school teacher. Be involved with your school teacher in how they are raising your children. Be involved with your local media. If you feel that you have local media that's holding power to account and reporting on the things in your community, make sure they're funded properly. If you can help by subscribing, do that. My point is that there are 100 things between nothing and running for office that the average person can do. And my family made me understand that. I didn't understand it until things started to happen that made me understand that I had a role to play. But once I understood that I had a role to play, I realized that my family had given me a template. And I'm not following the same template, because everybody in my family ran for office. I'm not doing that. But I am following a template that says, you are a member of an active society. You owe it to that society to fully participate. But again, it's kind of why I wanted to talk to you about this, because you live that truth too.
Yes.
You also had moments in your life where you could make a different choice. You could have been somewhere else, being a lawyer, not involved in any meaningful struggle.
Yes.
And you would have been a perfectly good human who was contributing to society. But sometimes we have to make choices that turn our lives in a different direction. But those are acts of courage.
Indeed. Indeed, they are. And now, as a journalist, you know, you talked about it already a little bit, but I want to delve a little bit deeper, because I get the chance to right now. Journalists are always told, or we are told, the consumers of journalism, that a journalist is supposed to be objective and step back and be able to tell the both sides, etc. And yet they don't. And yet they don't. What are the small acts of courage that journalists can and should be doing today?
Well, I think part of the problem with journalism, there's a misconception out there that the problem with journalism is bias. Mm-hmm. There has been bias in journalism since there have been humans walking the earth. In fact, most of the history of what we know to be journalism have been people who have bought newspapers and ultimately television stations that express their underlying sentiment. The problem in journalism is not bias. Humans exist with bias. Yes. We know how to manage bias in each other. You know, good signposting is important to let you know what your bias might be. The problem in journalism is reliability and accuracy. The problem with journalism is gaslighting, people who actually lie to you. So in a perfect world, you should be able to consume your journalism with a set of sliders on your phone or your computer to say, I want to understand what's going on in a particular place right now, and I would like it from the most reliable, I would like it to be conservative or liberal, well, however you want it. Maybe that's a slider, right? Conservative or liberal. But you want it to be the most reliable conservative person, or the most reliable conservative outlet, and the most reliable conservative journalist, or the most reliable liberal, or whatever the case is. You shouldn't be escaping the fact that there are nuances and opinions and biases in the news. You should be escaping lying.
Yes.
You should be able to triangulate the news to say, I have read this story from a conservative perspective and a liberal perspective and some other perspective, so that I know the story's real, first of all. And now I have an ability to deal with that. And when we think about all of the issues we deal with in society, financing of wars, climate change, labor, wages, economy, inflation, these are all things that should be discussed. What we have in the United States right now is a critical failure of our two-party system. And some of my viewers who skew liberal think this is fantastic. They enjoy nothing more than to see the demise of the Republican Party. It is terrible. It is terrible to have the demise of parties. It's terrible to have the demise of competing ideas. Healthy democracies exist by virtue of the idea of there being competing ideas, and that those competing ideas are held in such esteem that people will run for office knowing full well that they will lose. But they will represent their ideas to you so that you have the strength to stand by them so that views are not silenced, so that views are not eliminated. And that's, I think we in journalism have let people down and failed people. I think social media came in and said, stand aside, we'll finish the job for you. I think we have to be in a world in which we are not absent nuance. Again, opinion is not the issue. Can we bring nuance into these conversations? And we have got to re-engage with the idea that if politics is not what you want it to be right now, make it what you want it to be by being involved, by getting involved in civil society. Whether it's your civil service, whether it's your community organizations, build those things up as opposed to leave them. What we have in the United States, because of fears around the way elections are going, is volunteer election workers who are staying away. Our entire election system, believe it or not, in the United States is built on the idea that there are a lot of volunteers who carry out that work. We can't afford for them to decide that they don't trust the system, because then you won't actually have people to run the system. In your part of the world, we have a situation in which, however this ends with Israel and Gaza, it will end. And there will need to be a political system that comes out of what is left. And you and I have talked about this a million times, and you have said to me, whatever comes of it is going to have to be something that Palestinians decide, and it is not imposed upon them. Yeah. But doesn't it depend on there being a civic life? Doesn't it depend on there being people who are involved at the smallest levels and at the highest levels, right? Everybody can't always be running for president. Sometimes you need someone who is ready to take on the responsibilities, as my sister I write about in this book, of just getting the traffic light put in. Because you're going to need traffic lights as much as you're going to need presidents. And that's the part that I sort of encourage people to do. Get a little bit outside your space, make society a better place, consume news that's better, support news that's better, give up on that stuff that's garbage, and hope it goes away.
Well, I'm going to turn it back to you now, Ali. I hope I've done a good job of asking you the question.
You have been fantastic. I want to read you a small passage from the book, which is sort of most telling about how I think about politics. It was when I was 11 years old. We were 10 years into this move to Canada. My parents had finally settled into Canada, and they were so desperate because they'd grown up in South Africa where they couldn't vote because of the color of their skin. And then they had arrived in Kenya right before colonialism had ended, and they got to see a free Kenya for the first time. They got to see the British flag come down and the Kenyan flag go up. But because of tensions in Kenya at the time and Pan-African movements, very valid movements, there wasn't the space for them to participate as fully as they would have liked. So they finally get to Canada, and 10 years into this whole episode, my father decides he's going to run for office. And he gathers a whole bunch of people around in our living room to tell them he's going to run for office, and every last one tells them this is a ridiculous idea. This has never happened. No one like you has ever been elected to office. So he runs. He decides to run, and I'm with him on election day, and he's running in possibly the most conservative, as a liberal, in the most conservative district that there is to run in. So we were out on campaign day around 6:30 or so. Rush hour slowed to a trickle. My dad said he wanted to go back to the house and change into the suit that he was going to wear to watch the election results come in at our campaign headquarters that night. So while everyone else went back to the office to eat and wait for the returns, I rode home with my dad. After he changed and got his speeches ready, we left our house to return to the headquarters just before polls closed at 8. As we were driving, my father flicked on the radio right at 8 p.m., right as the news station launched into the top of the next hour, which opened with the news of the evening's election results. The polls have closed across Ontario, the announcer said, and it's too early to tell who will form the government tonight. He then continued, but there is one race we can call, and we can declare Dennis Timbrell the victor in the riding of Don Mills, Toronto. I couldn't believe it. It was literally 8:01. Over 100 races had been run across the province that day, and my father had just suffered the biggest, swiftest, most resounding loss out of all of them. I didn't understand how they could have known who won right after the polls had closed. How could they could have counted the votes already? I'd assumed it would take hours for the election to be called. I didn't understand anything about exit polling and projections or any of that, but they were able to call it based on nothing more than the fact that Dennis Timbrell was the safest incumbent running anywhere in the entire country. His victory was as inevitable and as obvious as the nose on my face. I was shocked. I glanced up at my father, expecting him to be confused and angry as well, but the look on his face betrayed nothing but ease and contentment, which confused me. "I can't believe we lost," I said. "Of course we lost," he said with the biggest smile. "We were never going to win." "What?" I said. "What do you mean we were never going to win? What was this all about?" "We ran because we could," he said. "I stood for what I believed in. People had a chance to vote for me, and more people voted for the other guy than voted for me. That was always going to happen. I knew that. But I ran. And now that I've lost, our life goes on. We don't get arrested. We don't get shunned. Nothing bad happens." It blew my mind. For the whole campaign, little 11-year-old me had been looking up to my dad, seeing him on stage, doing the debates, thinking that was the coolest thing in the world, not understanding politics at all. I'd honestly believed we were doing it because we had a shot at it. It was going to be so amazing when we won. When we pulled up to the campaign office, I was still trying to process it all. But then we walked in the front door, and people started to clap and cheer. There weren't any tears. I thought, what are you all happy about? We lost. But I was the odd man out because I was apparently the only one who thought we were going to win. My dad promptly went in the back and called Dennis Timbrell and congratulated him on his victory. It was a cordial conversation that lasted under a minute, and that was that. My dad came out, he thanked the staff, and what I remember about that moment is that everyone in the room was jubilant and ecstatic, except for my father. The staff were excited because they thought we'd moved the needle. I would subsequently learn that they were celebrating because my dad had taken the Liberal Party from third place to second place, which was the difference of maybe 1,000 votes. But we'd made a solid dent in the district's conservative majority, paving the way for a real victory in the future. My father, on the other hand, was at ease. That's how I would describe him. He had done what he needed to do, and he had a look of satisfaction that it had been done. Thanks to my father, that was the night I learned that there is a deeper way to think about politics, which for so many people has become a dirty word. Politicians are all crooks, they say. The system is rigged. I don't trust any of them. And it's true, there's no shortage of politicians who provide reasons not to trust politicians. But the world is full of people who engage in politics for the right reasons. I know that because my immediate family is full of people who engage in politics for the right reasons. And on that night in 1981, in that dingy storefront campaign office, full of people celebrating, simply because they'd exercised their right to engage in politics for the right reasons. To this day, when I hear people run down politics and politicians, I recoil, because cynicism about politics is a luxury of those who have never had to experience life without it. Yeah. And if those people ever truly lost their ability to participate in the system, they'd never take it for granted again.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Thank you to all of you. And thank you to you, my friend.
Thank you, Adi. Thank you. And I think you're doing a book signing now.
I'm gonna sign some books. Any questions from anyone before I go over and do that? Comments, criticisms, anybody who just doesn't want to take a book? All right, then we'll go over there, and anybody who wants to talk to me over there can do it while I sign a book for you.